The night my sister stood in my living room wearing my engagement ring, smiling like she had won something she deserved, my entire understanding of family loyalty shattered in silence. I did not scream. I did not fight. I simply stepped back and let her take everything. What she did not realize was that I already knew the truth behind our family, and letting her win was the first move in a long, quiet reckoning that would destroy everything she thought she controlled. Before we go deeper, tell me where you are watching from, and if you have ever trusted family only to feel betrayed. Stay with me, because what happened next changed not only my life, but the truth about who we really were. My name is Lillian Harper, and until that night I believed in something simple and dangerous, that blood meant loyalty. I lived in Seattle in a quiet townhouse I had spent years saving for. I worked as a financial compliance analyst for a mid-sized investment firm, the kind of job where details mattered and trust was currency. I built my life carefully, step by step, after growing up in a household where attention was never evenly distributed. My younger sister Vanessa had always been the center of everything. She was charming in the way that made people forgive her before she even did anything wrong. Growing up, she received praise for things I worked twice as hard to achieve. If I earned something, it was expected. If she did half as much, it was celebrated. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself family dynamics were messy, but love was still there underneath. That belief lasted longer than it should have. Our mother Diane ran a small but profitable property management business. When I was younger, I helped her organize paperwork, track expenses, and clean up accounts. Vanessa never showed interest in the business, but she showed interest in the lifestyle it provided. Expensive gifts, flexible rules, endless second chances. Years later, I moved out, built my own career, and distanced myself from the chaos. Vanessa stayed close to our mother, eventually taking a more active role in the business, or at least that was what everyone believed. When I got engaged to Daniel, it felt like I had finally created something separate from my family's imbalance. Daniel was stable, thoughtful, and grounded in a way that made me feel safe. He listened when I spoke. He respected the boundaries I had learned to build. Or at least that was what I thought. 3 months before the engagement party, small inconsistencies began appearing in my mother's business records. It started innocently. My mother called me one evening, her voice tight with frustration. She said numbers were not adding up. Rent payments were missing. Vendor expenses were duplicated. She blamed software errors, then employees, then herself. I offered to help. The moment I opened the files, something felt wrong. Transactions were being moved in patterns that looked deliberate, not accidental. Funds were transferred between accounts in a way that masked their origin. Expenses were inflated, then written off. It was not chaos. It was structured manipulation. Fraud. I spent nights quietly reviewing statements, comparing records, tracing flows. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became someone inside the business was siphoning money out in controlled amounts. And the access logs pointed to Vanessa. At first, I refused to believe it. Vanessa was careless, impulsive, selfish at times. But this required planning, patience, calculation. It required someone who understood how to hide patterns. Then I remembered something that made my stomach drop. She had been asking me questions months earlier. Casual, almost playful questions about compliance loopholes, audit triggers, reporting thresholds. I answered them lightly, assuming curiosity. I had unknowingly taught her how to avoid detection. The realization hit me like a physical force. But that was not the worst part. As I dug further, I found something else. A separate set of transactions connected not to my mother's business, but to an account I recognized instantly. My own. Small withdrawals at first, then larger transfers masked as joint expenses. Then a line that made my hands freeze. A payment labeled under Daniel's name. I sat there staring at the screen, trying to force the numbers into something logical, something explainable. There was no explanation that did not lead to betrayal. I did not confront anyone immediately. That was not how I worked. I needed certainty, not emotion. So I watched. Over the next weeks, I gathered everything quietly. Screenshots, statements, access logs, email trails. I built a timeline so precise that it could not be denied. Vanessa was embezzling money from our mother's business. She was also redirecting funds through accounts that intersected with mine. And Daniel was not unaware. He was involved. Every piece of evidence tightened something inside my chest, but I did not let it break me. Not yet. Instead, I paid attention to behavior. Vanessa became more confident, more dismissive. She made subtle comments about how I was too rigid, too cautious, too slow to enjoy life. Our mother laughed along, brushing it off as harmless teasing. Daniel grew distant in a way that was almost imperceptible unless you were looking for it. Late messages, vague explanations, a slight shift in how he avoided eye contact when finances came up. Then came the moment that connected everything. I walked into a restaurant one evening earlier than expected for a dinner reservation. I saw them before they saw me. Vanessa and Daniel, sitting too close, laughing too easily, sharing something that was not meant to be shared. I did not make a scene. I turned around and left. That night I went home, opened my laptop, and reviewed everything again, this time not as a daughter or a fiancé, but as an analyst. The pattern was undeniable. Vanessa had been using the business to funnel money. Daniel had been helping her move it, and together they had positioned themselves to take something even bigger, my inheritance, because buried in my mother's financial structure was a clause I had almost forgotten about. A clause that transferred majority control to the child most actively involved in the business, Vanessa. Unless evidence of misconduct surfaced, that was when I understood the full scope. This was not impulsive betrayal. This was a coordinated takeover, and I was the obstacle they planned to remove quietly. So I made a decision that changed everything. I would not confront them. I would not warn them. I would let them believe they were winning. Because the only way to dismantle something this calculated was to let it unfold completely. And that is why when Vanessa stood in my living room wearing my engagement ring, I did not fight her. I let her take it. I let them both believe I had lost. Because I was not losing. I was documenting. And the moment they crossed the final line, I would make sure there was no way back for either of them. The engagement party was the stage they chose, which made it perfect for me. It was held at a waterfront venue overlooking the gray stretch of Puget Sound, elegant but intimate. Our mother invited extended family, business partners, and close friends. Vanessa arrived early, moving through the room like she already owned it. Daniel stayed close to her side. Not mine. I watched everything. Every glance, every touch, every moment where they forgot to pretend. People noticed something was off, but no one could name it. That is how denial works in families. It fills in the gaps with comfort. My mother especially refused to see anything wrong. She smiled too brightly, spoke too loudly, and ignored the tension sitting just beneath the surface. When it was time for the toast, Daniel took the microphone first. He spoke about love, about partnership, about building a future. His words were polished, practiced, empty. Then he did something I had not expected. He paused, looked at Vanessa, and said, "Sometimes the person you are meant to be with is not the one you started with, but the one who truly understands you." The room went still. I felt the shift ripple through the crowd. Vanessa stepped forward, her hand slipping into his, and just like that, the truth was no longer hidden. Gasps, whispering, shock. My mother's face drained of color. Someone dropped a glass. I stood there letting the moment stretch, letting the betrayal reveal itself fully, publicly, irreversibly. Vanessa looked at me, then not with guilt, but with something close to triumph, as if she had finally taken the one thing she believed I valued most. And then she said it. "You always had everything handed to you, Lillian. It is my turn now." The irony was almost unbearable, because she truly believed that. She truly believed she was correcting some imagined injustice, that she was justified, that this was her moment. I stepped forward slowly, every movement deliberate. "Are you finished?" I asked. My voice was calm. Too calm. That was when Daniel frowned slightly, the first crack in his confidence. "What do you mean?" he asked. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. Not dramatic, not aggressive, just precise. I said, looking directly at Vanessa, "Are you finished pretending this was only about him?" The room shifted again, confusion layered over shock. I placed the folder on the table near the microphone. "This is a full record of financial transactions from the past year in Mom's business," I continued, "including unauthorized transfers, falsified expenses, and routed payments." My mother shook her head immediately. "Lillian, this is not the time." "It is exactly the time," I said, not raising my voice, but not backing down either. Then I turned to Daniel. "And this," I added, pulling out a second set of documents, "shows how those funds were moved through secondary accounts, including one under your name." Silence. Heavy, suffocating. Vanessa laughed, but it was strained. "You are being dramatic." "Am I?" asked. I flipped to a page and held it up. Dates, amounts, account numbers. Undeniable. Her expression flickered. Just for a second. That was all I needed. I continued, each word landing with intention. "You accessed the system using Mom's credentials on multiple occasions. You created duplicate invoices. You redirected payments. and you used information I shared with you to avoid triggering audits. I let that sink in. Then I delivered the final piece, and Daniel helped you move the money. Now the room was no longer just shocked. It was divided. People stepped back. Conversations erupted. The illusion of celebration collapsed into confrontation. My mother looked between us, her confusion turning into something else. Fear. Vanessa's composure began to crack. You cannot prove anything she said, but the certainty was gone. I met her gaze. I already have. And for the first time that night, she realized something she had not considered. I had never been behind her. I had been watching her, waiting. And now there was nowhere left for her to hide. Tell me when you are ready, and I will continue with part 4, where alliances form, tensions escalate, and the story takes an even darker turn. The room did not recover after that. It splintered. My mother stood frozen beside the cake table, one hand still wrapped around a champagne flute she no longer seemed aware she was holding. Daniel looked as if someone had kicked the floor out from under him. Vanessa, however, did what she had always done when cornered. She went on the attack. She is lying because she is humiliated, Vanessa said, turning toward the guests with a sharp, shaking laugh. She cannot handle the fact that Daniel chose me. It was a clever move in a shallow way. Reduce everything to jealousy, make betrayal look romantic, make evidence look emotional. That approach had worked for her before because people liked easy stories. A bitter sister was easier to digest than a daughter uncovering theft inside her own family. But the problem with easy stories was that they collapsed under documentation. I opened the folder on the table and slid several pages toward my mother's attorney, who had been invited as a family friend. His name was Walter Hayes, a silver-haired man who had known us for years. He was cautious by nature and not easily manipulated by theatrics. He read the first page, then the second. The lines in his face tightened. "Diane," he said quietly to my mother, "you need to stop talking and start listening." That sentence landed harder than any shout could have. My mother slowly set the glass down. Her eyes moved to me, searching my face for some sign that this was exaggerated, that I had misread something, that there was still a version of reality where she had not lost control of both her daughters in the same night. "There has to be some misunderstanding," she said. I wanted to feel sorry for her. Part of me did, but another part of me, the part that had spent years being dismissed whenever Vanessa crossed a line, had no softness left for denial. "There is not," I said, "and this is only the beginning." Walter took the folders and asked everyone except immediate family and a few essential witnesses to leave the room. Some resisted, most did not. People were already whispering as they collected coats and bags, hungry to carry fragments of the scandal into the night. Within minutes, the celebration was gone. The flowers remained. The candles still flickered. But the atmosphere had changed completely. It felt less like a party and more like the site of a controlled demolition. Daniel tried to step toward me once the room emptied. "Lillian, please," he said. "This is not what it looks like." I turned to him slowly. "That sentence is for accidents," I said, "not for patterns." He ran a hand over his face, struggling to compose himself. "I made mistakes," Vanessa scoffed. "Do not talk to her like she is some judge." I looked at her. "I am not the judge. I am the witness you underestimated." Walter asked for access to all original records from my mother's property management business. I had expected that, so I had already uploaded copies to an encrypted drive and shared the access information with him that afternoon. I had planned for panic. I had planned for denial. I had planned for someone trying to destroy evidence. What I had not planned for was my mother still trying to protect Vanessa after seeing enough to understand the danger. "She is my daughter," my mother whispered almost to herself. "I am too," I said. The words fell between us with brutal simplicity. That was the first moment she looked ashamed. Not devastated, not furious. Ashamed, because somewhere deep down, she knew this was not just about money. It was about years of favoritism fermenting into entitlement, and entitlement mutating into crime. Walter advised my mother to freeze all internal access to company accounts immediately. He also told her that if the records held up, she could face legal exposure herself if she delayed acting once informed. That finally reached her. Fear of consequences did what love should have done much earlier. By midnight, Vanessa's access to the company systems was revoked. Temporary holds were placed on several accounts. Walter arranged for an outside forensic accountant to begin reviewing the books first thing the next morning. Vanessa responded with outrage. "You are all acting like I robbed a bank," she snapped. Walter did not even look up from his notes. "No," he said. I am acting like you may have committed fraud. Daniel paled at the word. I noticed that, I stored it away. Because guilt never moved evenly between conspirators. One usually broke before the other. When we finally left the venue, the cold wind off the water cut straight through my coat. I stood alone near the parking lot for a moment, breathing in air that tasted like salt and rain and something newly broken. My phone buzzed almost immediately. 3 messages from extended relatives asking if I was all right. 2 from former coworkers of my mother who had apparently heard enough to worry. And 1 from a name I did not expect. Maya Torres. She had worked for my mother's business for almost 5 years before abruptly resigning the previous summer. According to family gossip, she had left because she was disorganized and unreliable. Vanessa had repeated that version, often always with a smirk, as if Maya's departure proved that no one else could handle the job. The message was brief. I saw part of what happened tonight. You were right to bring it up publicly. Vanessa did something similar to me. If you want the truth, call me. I stared at the screen, then called immediately. Maya answered on the second ring. Her voice was calm, but there was something beneath it that sounded like relief. The relief of finally hearing someone say out loud what she had lived through in silence. We met the next morning at a coffee shop near Pioneer Square. She arrived in a navy wool coat, hair tied back, carrying a folder thick enough to make my pulse sharpen. I kept everything she said before even sitting down, because I knew one day she would do this to someone else. According to Maya, Vanessa had not simply been careless or greedy. She had been strategic for longer than anyone realized. When Maya worked under her, Vanessa regularly pressured staff to backdate records, alter rent statuses, and process vendor payments without full documentation. Whenever Maya objected, Vanessa belittled her, mocked her, and implied she was lucky to have a job at all. She liked creating confusion, Maya said. It made her look like the only person who knew what was happening. That matched what I had seen growing up. Vanessa did not just want attention. She wanted dependency. She wanted people uncertain enough to surrender control. Maya slid several printed emails across the table. In them, Vanessa instructed her to reclassify deposits and move maintenance reserves into temporary operating lines. The wording was careful, but the intent was obvious to anyone who understood bookkeeping. She told me if I could not follow directions, maybe I was not smart enough for the industry, Maya said. Then, when I refused to sign off on one of the reports, she told your mother I was sabotaging the business. I clenched my jaw. My mother believed her. Maya gave me a look that was sympathetic but unsparing. Your mother believed what was easiest for her. That was hard to hear because it was true. By the end of that meeting, I had more than support. I had an ally with first-hand knowledge, a witness with documentation, and a perspective from outside the family myth that had protected Vanessa for years. Maya was the first. The second came from somewhere even less expected. Elliot Graves, one of the company's longtime maintenance contractors, asked to meet after hearing rumors that an audit had begun. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with a face permanently marked by wind, sun, and plain-spoken honesty. He sat across from me in his truck outside one of the managed properties and handed me a stack of invoices. She told me to bill for work. I never did, he said. At first, I thought it was for tax timing or some bookkeeping thing. Then she started asking me to split invoices and route one copy through a separate email. Did you do it? I asked. He looked me directly in the eye. For a few months, yes. Then I stopped when I realized she was skimming. I kept copies because I knew I might need to save my own skin. He was angry but also embarrassed. That mattered. People who had been used often carried shame that made them less willing to come forward. I knew I would need to handle him carefully, not because he was fragile, but because he had spent months convincing himself he had only played a small part. You should tell Walter everything I said. I will, he replied. But I wanted on record that I never stole from your mother. I got played. So did a lot of people, I said. The third ally arrived through my own work life, and that alliance came at a cost. At my firm, I had a colleague named Priya Bennett. She worked in internal investigations and had the kind of mind that saw motive where others saw noise. I could not involve my employer formally because of confidentiality and conflict issues, but I trusted her judgment. I showed her a version of the records with sensitive client information removed. She studied them in silence for several minutes. This is bigger than simple embezzlement, she said at last. She layered it. That means she expected scrutiny eventually. I nodded. I think she was preparing to take over my mother's business entirely. Priya leaned back. Then your sister is not reckless. She is ambitious and reckless, which is worse. She offered something even more valuable than analysis. She connected me with a retired forensic examiner. She respected a woman named Nora Winslow, who had spent decades unraveling financial fraud cases. Nora agreed to consult unofficially with Walter's team. By the end of the week, what had started as my accusation became a growing network of people, each carrying a different piece of the same ugly structure. Maya had emails and memory. Elliot had invoices and informal instructions. Priya had strategic insight. Nora had pattern recognition sharp enough to turn scattered anomalies into a prosecutable map. And I had the timeline. For the first time since the engagement party, I felt something unfamiliar. Not relief, momentum. Vanessa, meanwhile, tried to seize control of the narrative before the facts outran her charm. She posted vague messages online about betrayal envy and women being punished for refusing to apologize for choosing happiness. Some relatives responded with sympathy. A few called me cold, vindictive, dramatic. One aunt sent a message asking whether exposing my sister publicly had really been necessary. I stared at that message for a long time. That was the heart of it, was not it? Not whether Vanessa had done it. Whether I had been polite enough while being betrayed? I did not answer. Daniel attempted a softer strategy. He sent flowers to my house. I left them outside until the petals browned and sagged. He sent long messages claiming Vanessa had manipulated him, that he had gotten pulled in too far, that he had intended to tell me everything. That last lie offended me the most, not because it was cruel, because it was lazy. I knew exactly when he had intended to tell me, never. Still, I did not block him, not yet. Nora advised against it. People reveal themselves when they think there is still a chance, she said. So I let him keep talking, and eventually he said something useful. He requested an in-person meeting, insisting there were things Vanessa had done that I did not know. I agreed on the condition that we meet in a public place, and that I control the location. We sat in the corner of a hotel lounge on a rainy Thursday afternoon, while he looked like a man trying to outrun his own reflection. She has copies of documents, he said in a low voice. Not just financial records, personal documents, trust papers, property files. My entire body sharpened. What kind of property files? He hesitated. The lake house deed. Your grandmother's revised trust. Some old insurance policies. She said if everything came out, she had leverage. That was when the betrayal deepened from financial crime into family architecture. Our grandmother had left behind a trust that had always been described as simple. The main assets were supposedly divided in broad terms, with my mother retaining management authority until certain conditions were met. I had never pushed for details because I did not care about fighting over family property. That disinterest, I realized, had made me easier to exclude. What leverage, I asked. Daniel swallowed. She said the trust amendment would make you look selfish if you challenged it. I held his gaze, or it would reveal that she altered something she should not have touched. He looked away. That told me enough. Somewhere inside the family records buried beneath my mother's denial and Vanessa's entitlement, there was another secret, something tied to inheritance ownership and the story we had always been told about who deserved what. The fraud investigation was no longer just about missing money. It was about motive, and motives were rooted in older wounds. That night, Maya came with me to my mother's office after Walter secured permission to review archived files. The building was empty, the hallways humming with the stale mechanical quiet of after hours. We opened cabinets, searched storage boxes, cross-checked old binders against digital indexes. At first, nothing. Then, near the back of a records closet, tucked inside a mislabeled tax archive box, I found an envelope. No stamp, no seal, just my grandmother's handwriting across the front. For Diane, if timing ever matters. I froze. Maya looked over my shoulder. Open it. Inside were copies of correspondence between my grandmother and an estate planner, discussing concerns about coercion, unequal influence, and a fear that one granddaughter was being rewarded for performance while the other was being overlooked for reliability. There was no final confession, no dramatic revelation, but there was enough to show that my grandmother had seen the imbalance long before I had the language to name it. At the bottom was a note in my grandmother's hand. The one who serves quietly is often the one the family leans on while praising the one who performs. That imbalance does not stay small, it becomes character then damage. I sat down hard in the chair behind my mother's desk. Maya said nothing for a while. Then she spoke softly. She knew. Yes, I said, and no one listened. The discovery did not prove Vanessa altered the trust, but it proved something else. The fracture in our family was not new. It was inherited, fed, protected, and if I wanted to stop it from swallowing the rest of us, I would have to expose not just a thief, but a whole system of indulgence that had raised her. That understanding changed how I approached the next phase. I stopped thinking like a wounded sister. I started thinking like someone dismantling a house with rot in the walls, one board at a time. By the end of that week, our alliance was strong enough to frighten anyone paying attention. Walter had launched a formal internal review. Nora had begun mapping layered transfers across connected accounts. Maya was preparing a sworn statement. Elliot was ready to testify about falsified vendor billing. Priya had identified reporting thresholds Vanessa appeared to exploit repeatedly. And I, for the first time in my life, was no longer standing alone while my family told me to be reasonable. But suspense has its own intelligence. Just when evidence started aligning, just when I felt the structure turning in our favor, a new unease settled over me. It began with little things. An email thread disappearing from the shared archive after I had already flagged it. A witness rescheduling unexpectedly. A file drawer in my mother's office left half open when no one admitted being there. Then Walter called me late one evening, his voice lower than usual. "We may have a leak," he said. The words sent a cold line down my spine. "From where? I do not know yet," he replied. "But someone is anticipating our moves." I stood in my kitchen staring at the dark window over the sink, my own reflection barely visible against the night outside. Alliances had formed. Truth was building. But somewhere inside the network we had created, someone was no longer just afraid. Someone was feeding Vanessa information. And if that was true, the next blow would not come from the outside. It would come from someone standing close enough to be trusted. Once Walter said the word leak, every room began to feel different. Every conversation carried a second layer. Every expression had to be re-examined. I hated that shift more than I hated the scandal itself. Fraud was ugly, betrayal was brutal, but suspicion was corrosive. It stained even the people who had done nothing wrong. It made you question timing, tone, silence, hesitation. It made you rehear every sentence in reverse. At first, I tried to stay rational. A missing email could be an administrative mistake. A rescheduled meeting could be coincidence. An open drawer could be carelessness. But then Vanessa filed for emergency temporary control over a portion of my mother's business operations, claiming Diane was emotionally compromised and that I was manipulating the company's records out of personal revenge. The petition was not just aggressive, it was informed. It referenced issues we had only discussed inside a small circle. Specific concerns, specific dates. Even the fact that Maya was preparing a statement, though, that information had never left Walter's office, and a limited set of direct conversations. My mother called me in tears after receiving notice. "She is trying to say I am not competent," she said. "She is trying to paint you as unstable." I closed my eyes for a moment. "That means she knows we are close." Walter agreed. "Someone is talking." The emergency hearing was scheduled with humiliating speed, and for the first time since the engagement party, Vanessa had succeeded in forcing me into a defensive position. If the court granted temporary authority even partially, she could interfere with records, pressure tenants, intimidate staff, and muddy the financial picture enough to delay full exposure. This was no longer just about justice. It was about control of the evidence itself. The days leading up to the hearing were a blur of preparation, affidavits, copied records, and sleeplessness. I barely ate. Coffee turned metallic in my mouth. My thoughts started moving too quickly, and then not quickly enough. Maya remained steady. Elliot stayed cooperative. Priya continued helping from a distance. Nora, brilliant as ever, built charts that transformed chaos into sequence. And yet I could feel something slipping. Not in the evidence, in the people around it. My mother was the first to wobble. "Maybe we should settle something privately," she said during one meeting at Walter's office. "Maybe if Vanessa returns the money and agrees to step away for a while." "No," I said. Walter looked relieved I said it before he had to. My mother flinched. "She is still my daughter." "And I am still the daughter who told you the truth," I replied. "Why am I the only one expected to absorb damage quietly?" She had no answer. That silence told me she was still grieving a fantasy version of Vanessa, not dealing with the real one. It also told me she was vulnerable to manipulation, especially guilt. The morning before the hearing, I got another message from Daniel. I did not tell her anything. "Be careful who you trust." I stared at those words until anger gave way to something colder. He was warning me but also trying to position himself as separate from the betrayal. That was his style now. Never fully loyal, never fully accountable, always leaning whichever way offered survival. I did not respond. Instead, I went back through the last 10 days of communication, printing timelines, cross-checking who knew what and when. I wrote names on a legal pad. Walter, his paralegal, my mother, Maya, Elliot, Priya, Nora, myself. If I had been outside that circle, who would look most useful to turn? Not the loudest person, not the strongest. The one with access and insecurity, the one who might need money, validation, or protection. I circled 2 names, then I hated myself for doing it. The hearing itself was ugly. Vanessa arrived in a cream suit understated enough to signal seriousness, expensive enough to signal confidence. She did not look like a panicked thief. She looked like a woman prepared to explain away everyone else's discomfort as hysteria. Beside her stood an attorney, none of us recognized, younger than Walter, but polished and sharp. He argued that the accusations against Vanessa were part of a retaliatory campaign triggered by a collapsed engagement and long-standing sibling resentment. He implied that I had leveraged my financial background to create misleading interpretations of normal business irregularities. He suggested Maya was a disgruntled former employee and Elliot an unreliable contractor protecting himself. Then he introduced a statement from my mother. My blood went cold before I even heard it read. It was not a full exoneration of Vanessa, but it was close enough to do damage. In it, my mother expressed uncertainty about whether the records I provided reflected context accurately. She also stated that family tensions may have influenced the timing and presentation of my concerns. I turned toward her in disbelief. She would not meet my eyes. Walter, visibly furious, requested a recess. In the hallway outside the courtroom, he rounded on her. "Why would you sign something like that?" he demanded. My mother burst into tears. Vanessa said if I did not calm things down, the press could get involved. She said tenants would panic. She said the company would collapse before the truth came out. "She manipulated you," I said, my voice so tight it barely sounded like mine. "She is my daughter," my mother repeated again, and this time it sounded less like loyalty and more like addiction. Walter rubbed a hand over his face. "This statement undermines us." My mother looked at me, then pleading for understanding she had not earned. I was trying to protect all of us. "No," I said. "You are trying to protect yourself from admitting who she is." That landed, she recoiled. The judge did not grant Vanessa full control, but the damage was done. The court ordered a temporary neutral administrator to oversee core business operations while the investigation continued. On paper, that was a compromise. In reality, it slowed everything. Records access tightened, communication channels narrowed, and Vanessa left the courthouse smiling just enough for me to understand what she believed, that she had survived the first real blow. Outside, rain had turned the courthouse steps slick and reflective. Reporters had not arrived, but a few local legal observers lingered. Vanessa passed close enough to murmur as she walked by. "You should have stayed quiet." I looked straight at her. "You should have stopped earlier." Her smile sharpened. "You still do not get it. I do not lose to people like you. People like me. Responsible, patient, useful, easy to underestimate until the damage was already visible." By the time I got home, the exhaustion hit so hard my hands shook unlocking the door. The untouched flowers Daniel had sent days earlier were finally gone, thrown out by my neighbor after they began to rot. My living room still looked orderly, but nothing in my life felt stable anymore. I slept badly and woke to a new disaster. Maya was gone. Not dead, not missing in a criminal sense, just gone from our side. Walter called before dawn. His voice was clipped in the way it became when anger had to be forced through professionalism. She withdrew her statement. I sat upright in bed. "What?" "She says she does not want involvement anymore. She claims stress, retaliation fears, and uncertainty about what she remembers." "That is impossible," I said. "She had documentation." "She still does," Walter replied. "But without her testimony, opposing counsel will argue the documents are ambiguous." I was already out of bed, pulling on jeans, fury burning through the fog of sleep. Did she say why? No, only that she wants distance. I drove straight to her apartment in Capitol Hill, heart pounding the whole way with a mix of disbelief and dread. She opened the door after a long pause. Face pale, eyes shadowed from what looked like a sleepless night. "You should not be here," she said. "I deserve an explanation." She closed her eyes briefly. "No. You deserve better than this." but I cannot give you what you want. What happened? I asked. Did Vanessa threaten you? Maya gave a bitter laugh that had no humor in it. Threatened is a tidy word. Your sister sent me copies of private messages from my ex-husband's divorce attorney. Financial things, custody discussions, information she never should have had. My stomach dropped. She said if I testified, she would make sure those documents reached people who could hurt me professionally and personally. She said she would suggest I mishandled funds when I worked for the company. She already contacted someone on my board. I stared at her, the pieces clicking into place with sickening force. Vanessa had not just built fraud pathways. She had collected leverage on anyone who stood too close. Why did you not tell me? Because I have already lost enough, Maya said, and now her voice shook. I wanted to help you. I still want her exposed. But I have a son, Lillian. I cannot go to war with someone who has no boundaries when I am the one with something left to protect. I could not even argue with that. That was the cruel genius of people like Vanessa. They weaponized decent people's responsibilities against them. I stepped back, pain pressing so hard against my chest it almost felt physical. So that is it. Maya's eyes filled, but she held the line. For now. For now was not comfort. It was simply another way of saying I was about to stand more alone than before. I left her building numb. By noon, the consequences spread. Opposing counsel filed notice that one of our key witnesses had become unreliable. An anonymous source sent portions of my personal banking history to a gossip forum framing me as obsessive and financially controlling. A family friend texted to ask whether it was true I had secretly monitored Daniel for months before the engagement ended. The leak was no longer subtle. It was strategic character assassination, and someone had helped make it possible. I went back to Walter's office and demanded a full review of internal access logs. He resisted at first, claiming we needed to stay focused on the fraud case. I pushed harder. Finally, he gave in and had his paralegal produce sign in records email forwards and document access histories tied to the investigation files. That was when we found it. Late-night downloads, forwarded calendar invites, attachment previews from an account that had no reason to access half the folders it touched. The account belonged to Walter's paralegal, Janice. She had been in and out of every layer of the case from the start. Quiet, efficient, forgettable, in the way support staff are often wrongly assumed to be neutral fixtures instead of people with motives. Walter looked physically ill when he realized it. He confronted her that afternoon. She denied it for less than 3 minutes. Vanessa had approached her through a mutual social contact weeks earlier. At first, it was dinner compliments, small gifts. Then money. Then promises of a better position if Vanessa took control of the company and expanded operations. Janice claimed she had only shared scheduling details and broad strategic concerns. The digital records proved otherwise. She had leaked witness identities. She had flagged which documents worried us most. She had warned Vanessa before motions were filed. She had even forwarded a draft summary of Nora's preliminary findings. Walter fired her on the spot and immediately reported the breach, but the damage was done. I sat in his office while the late afternoon light turned the windows amber and dirty. Everyone looked worn down. Papers covered every surface. Coffee had gone cold in half a dozen cups. The energy that had once felt like momentum now felt like collapse in slow motion. I should have seen this, Walter said, voice rough with self-disgust. We all should have, Nora replied, not cruelly, just honestly. She picked the weak seam. That phrase stayed with me. The weak seam. Every structure had one, every family, every case, every alliance. Vanessa had found ours and sliced straight through it. The next blow came from my mother. That evening, she called and asked me to come over. Her house looked exactly as it always had, immaculate and controlled, but the illusion no longer comforted me. She sat at the kitchen island with a cup of tea gone untouched. I met with Vanessa, she said. Of course she had. I did not sit down. And she swears she never meant for this to get so far. I almost laughed from sheer disbelief. She filed against you in court. My mother's eyes brimmed. She says Daniel pushed some of it. She says she panicked after the engagement party. She says if we stop now, maybe there is still a way to avoid criminal charges. There it was. Not innocence. Negotiation. I felt the full weight of temporary defeat settle into my bones. You still want to save her. She is my child. So am I said again, and this time the words came out like something torn open. My mother started crying in earnest, but I could not comfort her. I had spent too many years being asked to understand everyone else's weakness while mine was treated like an inconvenience. She stole from you, I said. She humiliated me. She manipulated the business. She threatened witnesses. She corrupted the case. And you are still asking how to protect her from consequences. I am asking how to keep from losing both daughters, she whispered. That was the most honest thing she had said in days. I finally sat, not out of softness, but because my legs suddenly felt unsteady. You already lost the version of us where silence held this family together. That is over. She looked old then, not in years, in recognition. But even recognition did not mean courage. When I left her house, I knew two things with painful clarity. First, Vanessa had successfully fractured my alliance network and bought herself time. Second, my mother was still capable of becoming the instrument of my defeat, not because she was malicious, but because she could not bear to let go of the fantasy that both daughters could still be kept under one roof of excuses. That is what temporary defeat really looks like. Not just losing a witness, not just losing momentum, losing the hope that the people closest to the truth will choose it when truth becomes expensive. That night, I sat alone in my townhouse surrounded by binders, printouts, and the stale smell of stress that had soaked into every room. Rain tapped steadily against the windows. My phone remained silent for long stretches, then lit up with messages I did not want to answer. I thought about giving up for the first time, not because Vanessa had won, but because I was tired of paying for everyone else's refusal to see her clearly. Tired of being the reliable one, the composed one, the one who carried facts while other people carried feelings. Tired of being asked whether justice was worth the mess, as if the mess had been created by the person uncovering it rather than the person causing it. I sat on the floor beside my coffee table and let that exhaustion wash through me. No performance, no strategy, no careful restraint, just the raw, humiliating ache of realizing that doing the right thing had made my life smaller before it made anything better. And yet, even there, at the lowest point so far, another truth surfaced. Vanessa had not destroyed the case. She had wounded it. There was a difference, because for all her control, all her manipulation, all her talent for finding weak seams, she still had one fatal flaw. She believed people were useful only in proportion to what they could be made to hide. That meant she never accounted for the power of someone who had nothing left to protect, except the truth itself. I did not know it yet, but somewhere beyond the wreckage of that week, someone new was already watching the fallout. Someone Vanessa had overlooked, someone who would not fold. And when that person stepped forward, the entire balance of the fight would change. The call came on a Sunday morning when Seattle was still wrapped in gray rain, and the city felt half asleep. I almost did not answer because I had stopped expecting good news from unknown numbers. But something in me, some exhausted instinct sharpened by weeks of damage, told me to pick up. Is this Lillian Harper? The voice was male, older, measured. Yes. My name is Arthur Vale. I used to work with your grandmother's estate planner. I believe I have information connected to your sister, your mother, and a trust amendment that should interest you. For a second, I said nothing. I had learned to distrust surprise. Too many people arrived carrying half-truths, motives, or panic. But there was no theatrical edge in his voice. No fishing, no manipulation, only calm certainty. How did you get my number? I asked. Walter Hayes gave it to me after I contacted his office. I told him I would only speak directly if you were willing. That gave me enough to continue. We agreed to meet that afternoon in Walter's conference room. Arthur Vale turned out to be in his late 60s, with a disciplined posture, rimless glasses, and the kind of quiet presence that usually belonged to men who had spent decades handling difficult truths for wealthy families. He carried a leather briefcase worn smooth at the edges. When he set it on the table, he did not waste time. Your grandmother retained my former firm for estate planning consultation during the last years of her life, he said. I was not the primary attorney, but I handled document review and internal file control when her planner became ill. Walter leaned forward. Why are you coming forward now? Arthur's face tightened almost imperceptibly. Because I recognized your family name in a recent filing, and because I found a set of archived notes that should never have been ignored. My pulse quickened. He opened the briefcase and removed copies of letters, internal memos, and an annotated draft of a trust amendment. Not the finalized amendment, the draft before it. The draft that showed tracked revisions and objections. I stared at the pages while Arthur explained. My grandmother had indeed grown concerned that family pressure was influencing how assets would be managed after her death. She had specifically worried that Diane, my mother, would continue favoring Vanessa under the guise of protecting family harmony. So she instructed the estate planner to create language that rewarded actual stewardship, not appearances. The child most actively and responsibly maintaining the business would receive additional management authority, but only under verified compliance review, and only if no evidence of coercion, fraud, or self-dealing emerged. That language matters, Arthur said, because it appears someone later attempted to cite only part of the clause while concealing the rest. Walter looked up sharply, attempted. Arthur slid another document across the table. It was a memo from years earlier written by the estate planner noting an unusual request from Diane, asking whether a summary version of the clause could be circulated for convenience, without including the misconduct trigger language in general family discussion. The room went completely still. My mother had not forged the trust, but she had helped create the conditions that made Vanessa believe she could inherit control if she simply looked active enough and kept the ugly parts hidden. She knew the full terms I asked. Arthur met my eyes. She should have. That hit differently than I expected. I had spent weeks trying to decide whether my mother was blind, weak, manipulated, or complicit. The answer I realized was not singular. She was a mixture of all four changing by circumstance. She had not built Vanessa's fraud, but she had fed Vanessa a lifetime of distorted immunity. Arthur was not finished. There is more, he said. From the briefcase, he removed a sealed envelope bearing a notary mark and an old date. Inside was a statement from my grandmother, never formally filed but signed and witnessed. It was not a legal bomb in itself. It was something stranger, and in its way more powerful. It was a character declaration. In it, my grandmother described both granddaughters in painfully accurate language. Vanessa was identified as captivating, approval-seeking, and dangerous when protected from consequences. I was described as dependable, observant, and at risk of being overlooked because I did not demand attention while carrying responsibility. My grandmother specifically warned that family assets should never be entrusted to the granddaughter most skilled at performance over duty. No dramatic flourish, no sentimental apology, just truth written by someone who had seen the pattern and feared what it would become. I felt heat rise behind my eyes and hated it immediately. I was not crying over inheritance. I was grieving the fact that someone had understood all along and still had not stopped it in time. Walter looked stunned. Nora, who had joined us remotely through speakerphone, was the first to cut through the emotion. This changes motive analysis, she said. If Vanessa knew or suspected the full clause, then the fraud was not random extraction. It was strategic positioning for control while trying to neutralize the misconduct trigger. Exactly, Arthur replied. Then came the final document. A certified copy of an insurance-backed loan agreement tied to the lake house, executed months before my grandmother's death, and amended later under Diane's authority. The amendment rerouted reserve obligations in a way that made the property appear less stable on paper than it actually was. That mattered because it was later used inside family discussion to justify why certain management decisions needed to remain flexible and why Vanessa's increased involvement was supposedly necessary. In simpler terms, the family narrative had been engineered, not invented from nothing, engineered through selective presentation, omission, and emotional pressure. The evidence did not merely reinforce the fraud case, it welded the financial crimes to the long history of favoritism and manipulation that made them possible, every ugly piece now connected. Vanessa stole because she felt entitled. She felt entitled because Diane protected her. Diane protected her because she feared conflict more than corruption. Daniel joined because Vanessa offered proximity to power and money. The witness intimidation happened because exposure threatened not only a scheme, but the myth the scheme rested on. By the time Arthur finished the case, no longer looked like a messy family dispute with overlapping emotions. It looked like a deliberate effort to exploit family structure, business opacity, and emotional loyalty for financial gain. Indisputable evidence did not arrive as one dramatic revelation. It arrived as alignment, and alignment was finally happening. Walter moved fast. He filed to supplement the court record. He added Arthur's affidavit, the draft trust language, the estate memos, and the grandmother's statement as motive context. Nora integrated the new material into a revised forensic narrative that showed exactly how Vanessa's transactions intensified after she began appearing more publicly involved in the business. Priya helped me build a chronology that tied every false representation to a corresponding transfer account change or intimidation event. Then something happened that none of us expected. Daniel asked for immunity consideration in exchange for full cooperation. Walter called me the minute the request came in. He is offering original devices, message archives, and voice memos, Walter said. He claims he saved everything after he realized Vanessa might eventually blame him. I almost laughed from disgust. Of course he did. Cowards often documented crimes for the same reason they committed them. They wanted benefits without risk, and they wanted escape routes ready when loyalty soured. Still, evidence was evidence. I agreed to review it. What Daniel produced was revolting in its usefulness. He had backed up texts, deleted email drafts, private photos of paper records, and several voice notes Vanessa sent during late-night spirals when she thought she was speaking to someone equally ruthless. In one recording, she mocked my mother openly, calling her a sentimental gatekeeper with no stomach for numbers. In another, she referred to me as the useful sister who always does the hard part and still gets treated like furniture. That one sat in my chest like broken glass, but the most important recording came near the end. In it, Vanessa was furious after the engagement party. She said Daniel had become a liability because he was too emotional and too easy to scare. Then she said the sentence that would later matter most in court. If Diane panics, I can still force her hand. She knows the clause. She always knew. She just thought no one would ever push me hard enough to expose the ugly stuff. Walter replayed that portion 3 times. There it was. Knowledge. Acknowledgement. Intent. Not enough to charge my mother with Vanessa's crimes, but more than enough to destroy any remaining argument that this had all been innocent confusion. The new ally, however, was not Daniel. He was evidence with a pulse. The true reversal came from Arthur. Because unlike every other person in the case, Arthur had no family guilt, no romantic entanglement, no business dependency, and no fear of social fallout. He had retired comfortably. He had no child in the fight except professional integrity and personal conscience. Vanessa could not seduce him, shame him, flatter him, or frighten him. She had overlooked him because she did not know he existed. People like her never planned for the witness outside the circle. At the evidentiary hearing, Arthur was devastating in the calmest possible way. He did not grandstand. He did not moralize. He simply walked the court through document origins, revision sequences, retained notes, and standard estate procedures. He explained why the omission of the misconduct trigger from casual family summaries was material. He explained why the draft language mattered. He explained why any claim that Vanessa innocently misunderstood her position became far less credible once motive, timing, and transaction layering were considered together. Then Nora testified. Using charts, account maps, and transaction clusters, she showed how funds moved from tenant receipts into intermediate lines, then into expense masking, then into personal use patterns. She linked falsified maintenance reporting to reserve depletion and demonstrated how the hidden flows accelerated whenever questions about trust control surfaced internally. It was elegant and brutal. Vanessa's attorney tried to paint the analysis as inferential. Nora replied, "Inference is what people use when they do not have records. I have records." That line traveled through the room like a blade. Then Elliot testified about split invoices. Not perfectly, not dramatically, but honestly. He admitted his own mistakes and explained the progression from confusion to suspicion. That honesty helped him. It made him credible. Maya did not return to the stand, but under renewed protection measures, and after seeing the strengthened case, she allowed her contemporaneous emails and prior preserved communications to be authenticated through other channels. It was not as strong as live testimony would have been, but it was enough to restore part of what had been lost. Finally, Daniel took the stand. I did not enjoy watching him unravel, but I did watch. He described how the affair started after Vanessa framed me as controlling, rigid, emotionally unavailable. He claimed he believed at first that he was helping her balance things inside an unfair family system. Then he admitted he knowingly moved funds after she assured him the money would be corrected before anyone noticed. He admitted she discussed the trust clause repeatedly. He admitted she viewed the engagement not as sacred but as leverage. When opposing counsel pushed him about his self-serving motives, he folded exactly as I knew he would. "Yes," he said, voice cracking. "I am trying to save myself. But that does not make her innocent. That was not noble. It was useful. Sometimes victory did not arrive through purity. Sometimes it arrived because selfish people turned on each other under pressure. By the end of the hearing, the room had changed in a way I could feel physically. Not hopeful exactly, heavier than hope, more solid. The judge ordered expanded preservation, referred the fraud findings for criminal review, denied Vanessa any operational claim to the business, and authorized deeper examination of all connected property and trust-related representations. The neutral administrator remained in place temporarily, but now as a bridge toward recovery, not a shield for uncertainty. Outside the courthouse, Walter exhaled the way men do when they have been braced for impact too long. "She is cornered now," he said. I looked at the wet street. The passing cars, the city continuing, as if none of this mattered to anyone beyond our orbit. Cornered people are dangerous. Walter nodded. Yes, but this time she is dangerous on record. That distinction mattered. Because for the first time since I saw Vanessa and Daniel together in that restaurant, I understood something clearly. The situation had reversed. Not emotionally. I was still tired, still angry, still carrying scars I had not begun to process. But structurally, Vanessa was no longer directing movement. She was reacting to it. And once someone like her lost control of the story, the collapse was usually not graceful. It was total. That collapse began sooner than even I expected. 2 days later, criminal investigators requested full access to the records package. My mother, finally cornered by the weight of what had surfaced, gave a complete statement through counsel. She did not confess to Vanessa's crimes because they were not hers to confess. But she did admit she had long understood the business was being presented to the family in selectively distorted ways. She admitted she had withheld the full trust language during internal discussions. She admitted she ignored warning signs because confronting Vanessa felt unbearable. It was not redemption, but it was movement toward truth. And truth, once reinforced this tightly, no longer needed anyone to be brave all at once. It only needed them to stop lying. On the last evening before formal charges were expected, I went home, set my bag down, and stood in the quiet of my townhouse. Weeks earlier, that same room had held the shock of my sister wearing my engagement ring as if taking my life were an act of justice. Now the silence felt different. Not peaceful. Not yet. But steadier. My phone buzzed with a final message from Vanessa. "You think this makes you righteous, it just makes you alone." I looked at the words for a long time before deleting them, because for the first time I knew she was wrong. I was not alone, not in the way she meant. And that meant the end, when it came, would not just expose her crimes. It would expose the lies she had lived by for years. That power belonged to the person who could take the most. In reality, power belonged to the person who could survive the truth. The morning Vanessa was charged, the sky over Seattle was clear for the first time in days. It felt almost offensive. Something in me had expected thunder drama, cinematic weather, some outward sign that the universe understood what this moment meant. Instead, sunlight spilled across the kitchen counter while I stood barefoot with a mug of coffee I had forgotten to drink. Walter called just after 8. "It is done," he said. "Wire fraud-related counts, records falsification, intimidation issues tied to witness contact, and additional review on connected asset manipulation." She turned herself in through counsel an hour ago. I closed my eyes. I had imagined this moment dozens of times. Her panic. My satisfaction. The clean drop of justice finally arriving after months of noise and damage. What I felt was quieter, not triumph, release with edges. Because criminal exposure did not rewind betrayal. It did not give me back the sister I thought I had, or the mother I needed, or the version of myself that still believed loyalty naturally traveled through bloodlines. But it did something else. It ended the argument over whether what happened was real. That mattered more than revenge alone. Daniel was charged more narrowly and cut a cooperation agreement. His name spread through professional circles quickly enough that his reputation collapsed before any formal sentence landed. 2 firms quietly withdrew interest in hiring him after news of the financial misconduct surfaced through public filings. The man who once thought he could stand beside my sister, wear sincerity like a tailored jacket, and move between women and money without consequence, became exactly what he feared most. A cautionary story. Janice faced professional discipline and civil exposure for the breach. Elliot, because he had come forward early and cooperated fully, avoided the worst outcome, though. He lost contracts and spent months repairing his own name. Maya, after additional protections were arranged, did not return to the center of the case, but she no longer had to live as if Vanessa's secrets could dictate the rest of her life. My mother faced no criminal charge, but consequences arrived all the same. The company board, after consultation with the administrator and outside counsel, removed her from sole discretionary control and required a restructuring. Financial oversight became mandatory. Reporting lines changed. Old habits of informal authority were stripped away. Her humiliation was not public in the dramatic way Vanessa's was, but it was profound. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, she had to live inside a system where love could not erase record-keeping and tears could not replace accountability. She asked to see me a week after the charges. I agreed because I was done avoiding difficult truths, not because I was ready to offer comfort. We met at the lake house, the same lake house whose paperwork had been used, twisted, and selectively described until it became both symbol and instrument in our family war. The property looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically smaller, emotionally. As if once the lies around it dissolved, it lost some of the inflated weight everyone had assigned to it. My mother stood on the back deck, wrapped in a cream cardigan despite the mild air. She looked tired in a way that no sleep would fix. "I did not protect you," she said after a long silence. It was the first clean sentence she had given me in months. "No," I answered. She nodded as if she deserved nothing softer. I kept believing that if I loved Vanessa enough, if I made room for her mistakes, she would eventually become the person I wanted her to be. "And while you waited," I said, "everyone else paid for it." She looked out at the water. "Yes. There are moments when apology matters because it repairs something. Then there are moments when apology matters only because truth should be spoken aloud even if repair remains uncertain." This was the second kind. She handed me a folder. Inside were formal restructuring papers, a statement relinquishing any effort to steer trust interpretation privately, and a personal letter. "I am not asking you to forgive me today," she said. "Maybe not ever. But I am done protecting lies." That was not enough to heal us. It was enough to stop further damage. We sat for a while without speaking, the lake moving in small silver ripples under the afternoon light. I remembered childhood weekends there, the way Vanessa always found a way to turn games into competitions and affection into hierarchy, the way I learned early that peace often meant surrendering the spotlight. I had once believed that made me mature. Now I understood it had simply made me easier to use. When I left the lake house, I did not feel reconciled. I felt accurate. Accuracy can be its own form of freedom. Vanessa's final collapse came during pretrial negotiations. Until then, she had still clung to performance. She wore restraint in court. She let her attorney speak about misunderstanding, emotional instability after family betrayal, complex accounting. She was never fully trained to handle. But the recordings, the layered records, the witness intimidation trail, and the estate documents had stripped too much away. Her own messages contradicted her. Daniel's evidence boxed her in. Arthur's testimony removed the family fog she relied on. Eventually, she did what people like her do when there are no flattering exits left. She turned cruel in public. During one hearing break with attorneys just far enough away and reporters near enough to overhear fragments, she hissed at my mother, "This is your fault. You made her think she mattered." The sentence hung in the air like poison. My mother went white. I stood a few feet away and watched the final illusion die. Because that was the truth beneath everything. Not money, not Daniel, not even inheritance. Vanessa had built her identity around being the one who deserved more, because she was adored more, excused, more chosen more. The moment she saw me not as background support, but as a person whose claims might limit hers, I became something to erase. Our mother heard it too, fully, irreversibly. After that, something in Diane changed. Not overnight into strength, but away from denial. She stopped sending messages through lawyers that softened Vanessa's conduct. She stopped asking what mercy might preserve appearances. She answered questions plainly. She submitted records without delay. She let the consequences come. It was late, but it was real. Vanessa ultimately accepted a plea arrangement that included financial penalties, restitution structures, restrictions tied to business involvement, and a term of confinement followed by supervision. Some people in the family called it tragic. A few whispered that I should have handled everything privately, as though theft, manipulation, witness, intimidation, and calculated betrayal were intimate misunderstandings best tucked under holiday tablecloths. I did not argue with them anymore. Anyone still committed to comfort over truth was choosing their side voluntarily. and I was done recruiting people into reality. The company survived, though not in the same form. The neutral administrator remained during transition. New controls were built. Old staff who had kept their heads down began speaking more honestly. The board invited me to advise on compliance rebuilding in a limited external capacity. I accepted for a temporary term, not because I wanted the family business, but because I refused to let the ruins become another stage for selective memory. Maya returned gradually, not to the company but to my life. We started with coffee, then long walks, then the kind of friendship built less on similarity than on surviving the same storm from different angles. She introduced me to her son after a few months. He was funny, guarded, observant, and far too smart to be patronized. The first time he laughed easily in my kitchen while Maya argued with him about card game rules, I felt something loosen inside me. Not replacement, possibility. Priya stayed exactly what she had been throughout the worst of it. Sharp, loyal, impossible to flatter, and incapable of pretending that emotional messes should excuse structural harm. Nora became an unlikely mentor, calling every few weeks to ask whether I was rebuilding my actual life, or just becoming extremely efficient at surviving other people's damage. Arthur sent me a note after sentencing that simply read, "Your grandmother saw you clearly. I thought you should know that mattered." I kept that note. Walter and I developed the kind of respect that only grows after seeing each other under strain. He admitted once over lunch that he had underestimated the degree to which family systems could distort even obvious misconduct. I told him families were often the original training ground for plausible deniability. As for love, I did not go looking for it. I was too busy learning the difference between being needed and being valued. There is a lonely season after betrayal, where peace feels suspicious because chaos has trained your nervous system to expect interruption. I spent months in that season. I rearranged my house. I sold the ring Daniel once gave me and used the money for something absurdly practical and deeply satisfying, replacing every aging fixture in the townhouse that I had been postponing for years while waiting for some imagined shared future. New lighting, new locks, fresh paint in colors no one had to approve but me. It was not glamorous. It was mine. Chosen family did not arrive as a slogan. It formed the way strong things often do, through repetition and proof. Maya texting to check whether I had eaten before a hearing. Priya showing up with soup and sarcasm when I caught the flu. Nora forwarding an article with half the page highlighted, and a note that said, "Read this and stop pretending resilience means isolation." Arthur joining us for dinner once and telling stories about estate disasters that made even my case sound almost normal. Piece by piece, my life stopped revolving around who betrayed me and started centering who remained truthful when truth was expensive. That was the real revenge, though it no longer felt like revenge. It felt like release from the old bargain. The bargain that said I had to stay small to keep the family calm. The bargain that said being good meant being silent. The bargain that said blood loyalty outranked self-respect. All of it was false. The last time I saw Vanessa, she was being escorted through a side corridor after a post-sentencing matter. She looked thinner, harder, stripped of the effortless shine she once treated like armor. For a brief moment our eyes met. I expected hatred. What I saw was confusion. As if she still could not understand how the sister she treated like furniture had become the person standing after everything burned. She did not speak. Neither did I. There was nothing left to say. Because karma is not always theatrical. Sometimes justice is simply the moment when manipulation stops working and the truth remains standing without your permission. So that is my story. My sister took what she thought was mine. My fiancé. My place in the family script. My peace. My trust. For a while, I let her believe she had won because I needed the full shape of the betrayal to reveal itself before anything could truly end. And when it did, everything changed. Not because I destroyed her, because she finally crashed into consequences no one could soften for her anymore. Before I close, I want to ask you something real. Have you ever been the person in a family who told the truth and got blamed for the damage caused by someone else's lies? Do you believe family karma always arrives, or do you think justice only happens when someone is willing to risk being called difficult to make it happen? Share your experience in the comments because I know stories like this live in more homes than people admit. If this story stayed with you, please like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who understands what it costs to break a toxic family pattern. Your support helps stories like mine reach the people who need them most. Thank you for staying with me through all of this. I hope wherever you are, you learn earlier than I did that loyalty without truth is just another trap, and that the family you choose with honesty can become stronger than the one that first taught you silence.